We continue our series of conversations with all 17 candidates for Denver mayor who are on the ballot. City Councilwoman Debbie Ortega, welcome back.
Thank you.
You have served on City Council for a total of 28 combined years. You've been working in government since I think you were a teenager.
17 is when I started.
17. In a year where the polling shows that a lot of people in Denver want a change in direction. Is your experience a liability this year?
Kyle, I think my liability is an asset because now more than ever, this city needs somebody who understands how this city works. I know the inner workings. I've been successful getting many different kinds of legislation passed, working on lots of different projects like the Osarco cleanup in the Globeville neighborhood to, fighting for livable wages for workers. So I could go on and list those examples, but I think this is a critical time with so many challenging issues facing our city. You need somebody that knows how to get things done, and I'm that person.
If you had to list one singular accomplishment from your time on City Council that you're most proud of or you think has had the most impact, what would it be?
Wow, I could list a lot of them, but I think one that I'm very proud of is the doubling the fines for speeding in school zones, requiring people to slow down, because the year that we brought that legislation forward, we had 5 children that were struck by vehicles. A couple of them died. And I think our kids' safety is one of the most important things we need to focus on.
Do you know what year that was, or roughly what year that was?
Gosh, I was a district council person.
It was in your first stint on council.
Yes.
This was before I was in town. You were on council in what, 80s into the 90s, is that correct?
1987 to 2003.
To 2003. On that issue of safe streets, it gets a lot of talk kind of day to day in the city, not a lot of conversation in this mayor's race. Would that be a leading focus if you were elected mayor, or do you think that a lot of the work that needs to be done has been accomplished?
No, I think continuing to address safe streets is important because you see and hear about some of our corridors, like the Federal Boulevard corridor, where there's a lot of pedestrian traffic. 14th and Federal is one of the most unsafe intersections. I actually was successful getting $5 million earmarked to at least start doing something with that intersection, and we still haven't seen any work done there yet. So I think the fact that we have more modes of transportation on our roads, scooters, e-bikes, and to some degree they're playing a huge role in closing the gap on first mile, last mile connections to transit, but we have to continue to make those roads safe for all modes of transportation.
We haven't talked scooters with anybody in this race, but I'm just curious, because obviously you were on council when the deal came before the city, which companies were going to operate, how is that going to function? Do you think those companies are going to get their contracts renewed? Have they been good partners, the scooter companies, so far?
I think there needs to continue to be education for the people that ride them. Oftentimes I've seen them with the lights still flashing, that means they're still on. Somebody can go pick it up, and somebody who thinks that just by leaving it there, their credit card wasn't going to continue to be charged. I think there's just a lot of education around, stopping at stop signs, just being, following the rules of the road more than anything.
There seems to be pretty broad consensus on what the biggest issues in this race are: homelessness, crime, affordable housing. Given the fact that you've been in city leadership for so long, do you and your colleagues on city council share any of the blame for the current state of things?
I think that's a good question. I think there have been a lot of things that have been moved forward by both the administration. Some of those have been supported by City Council. As you know, I haven't always aligned with the mayor on some of the things they brought forward, like the Great Hall project, like the trash fee, the Hensel Park land swap. Those are examples of somewhere I didn't agree. And when you talk about where we're at with our homeless situation, there are a lot of things I would be doing different. And as mayor, one of the first things I would do is address making sure that we're helping people to self-sufficiency. We've been housing people in our motels for the last 2 years. And I think connecting them to employment and opportunities with training programs that can reskill and upskill them so they can take advantage of better paying jobs, I think that's where we really help them. Because at the end of the day, Kyle, these federal dollars that we're using to house them and feed them are going to run out. Our general fund cannot sustain that, and I want to make sure we have an exit plan that works for them and that works for the city.
Am I hearing you say that the city has had a decent role in housing people, but is just kind of letting folks languish there as opposed to moving them onto a more self-sufficient place? Is that what you're saying?
I think part of it is that it's a staffing issue. So for the large part, most of the operations that we've had, and at one point we had 15 shelters open. So that was motels and other properties that the city purchased. And we contract those out to other nonprofit providers that are running them. And it's a matter of trying to have staffing that can come in and work with them, whether it's, a human service person that can do benefit acquisition to connect them to resources they're eligible for, to making sure we have enough workforce people that can be in there helping work with them. Now, I think our city contracts with some of our nonprofit organizations, but there are a lot of other organizations that are privately funded that are doing amazing work. There's CareerWise, there's Mikasa Women's Resource Center. There are many others, and I'd like to be a catalyst in bringing them all together to look at how we can help connect people to employers that are dying for workers, and look at where we can reskill and train them so they can take advantage of better payable jobs.
When it comes to encampments in the city, you have said that you will forcibly clear encampments. And then the question becomes, what happens if somebody there refuses the city's offer of shelter or treatment? Would you seek to have people arrested simply for violating the urban camping ban?
So, as you know, this is a complex issue. You and I have been at the Denver Rescue Mission serving in the food line together. And there is no one size fits all. The people who find themselves in this situation come from every background. And I think it's providing an array of options. I want to make sure we are working to build more single room occupancy developments like the Barth Hotel and the YMCA downtown. That works for people who have found themselves in a situation where they get into housing and now they feel very isolated. As you know, during my in between my two stints on council, I did the Denver Road Home program. And I worked with individuals that we were getting into housing who needed a bed and some of the other basics when they got into their housing. But what I saw was many of them felt very isolated, and they needed that more communal living environment. So the SRO model will work for a number of people. It won't work for everybody. I'm focused on also looking at how we address the pipeline of housing affordability at different levels by making sure that manufactured housing is one of our offerings that will help get people into different price points. So, for example, if somebody goes through one of the 250 treatment beds that Arapahoe County is getting ready to open, or the state actually that is in Arapahoe County, I want to make sure that as people come out and they're stabilized, we've got different offerings that will help them be successful. And I've been working on a project in a different jurisdiction, and I've been a catalyst just bringing people together, looking at how we have different operations around the metro area, because I think having solutions not just in Denver but around the metro area, because we know oftentimes some of the people in Denver have come from different jurisdictions, not just in Colorado but from other places. So I want to be successful helping them and providing these different offerings.
You mentioned the modular housing thing, which I wanted to ask you about. I mean, I grew up in the country, so when somebody says modular housing, I think of mobile homes. I think of trailer homes. What are you talking about when you talk about modular housing?
So there's a company out of the UK by the name of Lattice, L-A-T-I-S. The gentleman who has come to Denver a couple of times, his name is Robert Luck. He is very interested in bringing his technology, which works the same way a car is built in a factory. Everything is done on site, cabinets, all the utilities, and then you just have a different contractor do the foundation, hook them up, and they can do one unit every 6 days. The goal is to pump out 15,000 of them. They could be single family, multifamily, rental, or for sale. So we can get them down at 40% cheaper. Where we can put them on public lands, then you take the land cost out and we get the price point cheaper. So this is where I'm talking about trying to address the missing middle for our firefighters, our bus drivers, school teachers that can't afford the price of housing that exists in our community today.
You have to import those from England, though? There's nobody in America that can make those?
No, that technology would be brought here.
Okay.
And the facility we're talking about hopefully would be in one of our neighboring jurisdictions. And if you think about the Ridgeview site, it's on 500 acres owned by the state. So when you start looking at where public lands are available, whether it's federal, state, RTD, local government, this is where we can start moving the needle. And where any of that land exists close to transportation, we can now move people around the metro area. So it's not as critical where you live as much as where you can afford. And then you've got the connectivity that can move you around.
Would you be looking for land and buy-in from neighboring jurisdictions, so not just Denver then?
So the goal would be for that jurisdiction to continue to own the land. So you take the land cost out.
But not just Denver land. You're
That's
talking
correct.
about
That's
Aurora,
correct.
Rapid
I
County.
think this is where we'd look at a whole regional partnership in how we solve the housing affordability issue and our homeless issue.
Okay. So I think you kind of gave us a broad overview of how you would address the homelessness issue, but I wanted to ask you again about that specific sticky issue when somebody is service resistant, but there's nothing else to bring them in on. Would you arrest folks for violating the camping ban?
So I'm not going to arrest somebody just because they're homeless, but I want to make sure people understand that we have different offerings. And I want to just segue to one issue, and I'll come back to answering your question in a minute.
Let's just answer this question, then we can move on to the other issue. Would you arrest somebody for violating the camping ban? Because that's not just being homeless, that's also violating the camping ban. Some folks in the race say that they would, some say they wouldn't. What would you do?
So I would deal with their illegal behaviors. That's where I would draw the line, because we have some people that at some of these encampments, and they're not all homeless. We know from the police department and our service providers, we have people that come in that are selling drugs that blend in among the homeless, and everybody thinks they're homeless, but they're not. So I want to deal with the illegal behaviors that we'd arrest anybody for anywhere else in the city if they were partaking in certain behaviors. So that's where I would draw the line. I think, again, I want to make it really clear that we're moving to get away from outdoor encampments. Now, we do have sanctioned encampments, as you know. City Council has continued to be asked by our housing office to fund those, and they've been moving around different parts of the city. There's some discussions about allowing that to be a permanent housing type, but I don't think we want to have permanent locations. I think the moving around is an important part. Again, part of that means you got to have hookups to water, other services that are important for the people living there. But it's stabilizing people's lives. So I think having those varying offerings of housing types allows us to get our outreach workers in to connect with people. The piece about all of this tied to what is happening with the kinds of drugs that have come into our community are exacerbating homelessness. These drugs are in our schools. They're across our communities. I think you remember the family in Commerce City. 5 people died thinking they were taking some, lesser drug, and it killed them. So I want to have a Metro Crime Task Force that will take these drugs, get them out of our cities, working with our neighboring jurisdiction. Same with the guns. Same with identifying who the people are that are stealing cars and catalytic converters, which is, you're a single mom and you're trying to get your kids to school, that turns your whole life upside down. So I think addressing this from a multi-pronged approach is how we really get at solving this problem. Enforcement is important, but it's got to be balanced in terms of having all those other offerings so that we're making a difference for people's lives. That's what I'm committed to.
You pivoted to folks who are in encampments and selling drugs. My question again is, would you arrest people simply for violating the urban camping ban?
If we continue to have a proliferation of encampments where we have the public safety issue, the health hazard that we've seen, some of these sites have become a sanitary problem that our city has had to deal with. And yes, part of that is access to restrooms. We've had portable restrooms that we've tried to move around the city. So it's a tough call, but I think if we continue to have this proliferation, I think we have to take a tough stand on it. But I want to make sure that we are addressing.
So is that a yes? I apologize. I've
needs.
asked 4 times. Is that a yes that you would arrest people simply for violating the urban camping ban?
It's focused on behaviors. I want to hone in on their behaviors.
All right, I don't know that we're going to get an answer there. We'll move on to something else. You've said that you'll work with businesses to repurpose underutilized commercial spaces into housing for the people who need it. And the barrier to converting commercial into residential is that it's really expensive.
It is, especially if it's downtown real estate.
What do you think the city ought to be doing in order to make that happen? And how much of that expense should be on the city versus developers?
So where we have commercial buildings, both downtown as well as on some of our commercial corridors, whether it's Colfax or Federal Boulevard, I think these are opportunities for us. I think downtown real estate is expensive. I had a conversation with some downtown property owners who said they think there may be an opportunity to do a blend of incomes. And so I think looking at the kinds of changes we need to make to the building code, the fire code, making it easy for that to happen. As you know, we're going to have a lot of downtown vacant buildings, and I'd like to make sure that we're activating them. So I think using our city resources to address, first of all, the backlog that we have in our permit office. First thing I will do is bring our workers back to work. And I would be doing things like what we did with our motor vehicle office, where we have them come in on a Friday and Saturday, close the office, and really hone in on getting those applications processed. I would also look at segregating out the small projects, like somebody doing a home fix-up project, and get those processed differently and much quicker than some of the bigger projects that are a lot more complex with a whole different team that would hone in on those. I also want to revisit whether or not our permit office is in the right place. It used to be part of our Public Works Department, which now is Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, which has grown tremendously. And so I want to look at whether or not that should be in a different place. Should it be a standalone agency where we have our different agency staff who review these to work together to get that done?
So back to this idea of converting commercial into residential. If developers were to say here, as they've said in other cities, we'll do it, but you need to lower the affordable housing component of it, lower that percentage, lower that burden on developers in order to make it financially feasible for them. Is that a non-starter for you? Would you be interested in hearing from them on that?
Well, as you know, we just passed an ordinance expanding housing affordability, and it had a time frame set by which people would have to start complying with it. We saw a mad rush of applications get into the pipeline, so they didn't have to comply with that. Housing affordability in this area is critical, and it's not just isolated to Denver. You go to Lakewood, you go to Commerce City, the prices have gone up. I mean, I know people have had to move as far away as Henderson and Hudson and Kingsburg, and then they don't have the transportation connections. So I think we have to look at different options, but also look at different price points. Again, I think we've been doing a lot on the 0 to 30 area median income population with a lot of resources, both during COVID as well as a dedicated revenue stream that we created. But it's that missing middle piece that we're not doing enough with, and I want to really close the gap on that as well so that we have a variety of price points where we can meet the needs. I grew up here. It didn't matter what you made, you could afford to live in this city. That's not the case today.
When I read your public safety plan, it calls for us to do a lot more of things that we're already doing, funding the STAR program for non-emergency or non-armed response to some emergency calls. So you're calling for de-escalation training for Denver police. Do you have any public safety proposals that are a significant departure from what we are doing now, as opposed to just more of what works, less of what doesn't?
I think getting back to the Metro Crime Task Force, that is different than what everybody else is talking about. And I think that's important. I think getting these drugs out of our streets, I don't know, Kyle, if you've read any of the writings that have been done by Sam Quinones, who wrote a book and has had many of his articles published in The Atlantic that talks about the lethal drugs that are on our streets across the United States today. I want to get those drugs out of our city. I want to get the guns out of our city. We've seen too many youth deaths and adults as well. And one of my colleagues, as you know, had a gun buyback program that took those guns and melted them down to lawn tools. I'd extend that program. I think that took a lot of guns off the streets. I think we need to look at different approaches to how we solve that, and having so many guns in our streets is not good for us. So I think that crime task force really is part of what I would do differently. And obviously addressing the staffing levels. You know, I have a daughter in the sheriff's department. The staffing levels there today are at 60% of the strength. And with our police department, as we have grown as a city, we haven't had our staffing levels in the police department grow to match the population. And again, this is a balancing act. The STAR program, I think, is good because you don't have to have a police officer respond to every call. But until we have these treatment beds, that person is going to continue, if they're homeless, for example, experience an episode over and over again. The treatment beds become a critical part of helping really change the needle for the life of that person. And I want to get back to the kind of contracts that we have with different organizations in our city. We push a lot of money out, and during ARPA, during the federal funding through ARPA, we provided a lot of resources to different organizations. We have one that administers most of the Caring for Denver dollars. You've got a CEO that makes almost $1 million. And in 2019, when Denver Post wrote an article, they had $41 million in reserves while we had people in crisis on the streets. This organization can bill for services at a significantly higher price than what all the other providers bill for. So I want to look at accountability of our providers and address accountability of individuals on the streets and throughout our communities. And again, that's where I get back to the behavior issue. So.
That sounds a lot like the audit that Chris Hansen's proposing for homelessness spending. Are you talking about something as formal as an audit of the service providers in town that are getting city funding?
I'm looking at performance-based contracts.
Okay.
And, through performance-based contracts, it means that they have to meet the benchmarks that are spelled out in the contracts.
A fellow candidate for mayor and environmental activist Ian Tafoya criticized you in our last debate, saying that you have chosen to compromise with polluters like Suncor, looking to mitigate their ill effects when the communities most impacted by the pollution want you to oppose Suncor and the other polluters in the community. Is that a fair critique?
I don't think it is. And I mean, all you have to do is go back and look at my track record on ASARCO. On the I-70 issue, the decision had been made by the mayor and my colleagues. I tried to run a resolution to address the impacts to the neighborhood by trying to route traffic around in a different way through 270. We actually, Dennis Gallagher and I paid for the American Planning Institute to come out and do an independent look. And their recommendation was you should route that traffic through 70, take 46th Avenue, turn it into a neighborhood street. So that was a recommendation that I was pushing. But when I saw that my colleagues and the mayor voted for a different proclamation to move forward and support the I-70 project, my focus was then trying to mitigate the impact to those neighborhoods. We submitted 40 pages of comments. That was all focused on mitigation. Everything was incorporated. The only thing was trees. And the community was successful coming back later and getting trees. Suncor, the days when I was the council person of that district, I worked with the state to try to hold them accountable, to make sure they continued to do upgrades and changes to stop the pollution that was impacting the neighborhoods that I represented, that was immediately to the south of the facility. So in recent days, I have not been actively involved with the conversations about Suncor, but historically I have.
One last question. So our recent Survey USA poll found that you are polling twice as well with Latinos as with the general population. Denver has not elected a Latino mayor in more than 30 years, has never elected a Latina mayor.
Right.
What would that mean?
That would mean that I would continue to serve the community as I have done. I have represented all sectors of the Denver community that I've represented. I would just happen to be the first Latina female mayor in the city of Denver. The way I would conduct business would be no different. I would continue to represent the interests of all of our community, our business sector, our neighborhoods. I've been a champion for a lot of issues in this city and being a good steward of the taxpayer dollars and making sure that we're not being frugal in how we spend money. It's why I oppose the trash fee. I mean, we could have just added composting for $33 million. but the administration wanted to take the entirety of the cost of the trash fee and put it on the backs of our, Denver households.
Didn't expect to end this here, but would you roll back the trash program then, or what's done is done and the new
I'd
programs-
revisit it. And one of the things I would do is talk to the frontline workers and get their thoughts, because I don't think we got their input at the very beginning of this process. So as the mayor, you're the administrator of all of these services and programs. We'll have a whole different council. 5 seats will turn over. Who knows if any of the others will? I think it's a different conversation to be had with the new council.
Debbie Ortega, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Kyle.